The first thing you notice, watching the screen test from the spring of 1967, is that the man in the chair doesn't look like Tony Curtis. The jawline is right. The eyes are his. But something behind them has gone somewhere you can't follow. And the technician watching the monitor in the booth apparently set down his coffee and didn't pick it up again for the rest of the reel. The studio wanted someone else for the part. They had wanted someone else for most of the previous decade's worth of difficult parts, and they had usually gotten their way. The role of Albert DeSalvo, the man accused of strangling 13 women in Boston between 1962 and 1964, had been offered to, declined by, or quietly removed from consideration for at least 4 actors before it came to Curtis. One of them reportedly said the material made him physically ill after 2 reads. Another completed a full week of preparation, including meetings with actual Boston homicide detectives, and then withdrew, citing unspecified personal reasons that his publicist declined to elaborate on. A third actor, whose name I've seen in 2 different production histories, but whose people have never confirmed the account, allegedly agreed, received a partial advance against salary, and then went silent for 3 weeks until the studio's lawyers sent a letter. Curtis said yes on the phone before he'd finished reading the script. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it's not how he usually made decisions, and because the decision would cost him something real. Not his career, which survived, but something harder to name and harder to replace. Bernie Schwartz was born on June 3, 1925, in the Bronx, in a tenement on Rivington Street that no longer stands. His parents, Emanuel and Helen Schwartz, were Hungarian immigrants who had come to America separately and met in New York, both of them carrying a language that their neighbors found incomprehensible and an attachment to the old country that the old country had given them no reason to maintain. Emanuel was a tailor, inconsistently employed. Helen was, by most accounts, severely and persistently mentally ill, in the specific way that the 1920s and 1930s had no real framework for addressing. She would later spend years in a state institution, and the effect of her deterioration on her children was not something Bernie Schwartz talked about in interviews with any precision until he was past 60. He had 2 brothers. Julius died at 3, hit by a truck on the street below their window while Bernard watched. Robert, the younger, survived childhood, but not much more. He would die young, and the manner of his death was something Curtis almost never discussed publicly, deflecting with a speed that interviewers learned to read as a wall rather than an invitation. The childhood that produced Tony Curtis was not, in other words, the kind that gets cleaned up easily. The poverty was real. The instability at home was real. He spent time in foster care. He came back. He ran with street gangs in a way that, in his telling, was more about belonging than about actual criminality, though the distinction probably felt less clear at the time. He was a small kid who learned early that charm was more portable than muscle, and considerably less likely to get you hurt. The Navy took him at 17. He served in the Pacific, was present at the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Proteus, and returned to New York in 1945 with a particular quality that a lot of men came back with from that war. A feeling that survival itself was provisional and should not be wasted on small ambitions. He enrolled at the dramatic workshop at the New School on the GI Bill. He was not, by the accounts of his instructors, a technically gifted student in the conventional sense. He didn't have the discipline for text analysis. He was impatient with exercises, and he had a habit of performing rather than acting, which is a distinction that drama teachers spend careers trying to explain, and that students either eventually feel or they don't. What Curtis had instead was an intensity that was hard to manufacture, and a face that the camera found irresistible in a way that even skeptical instructors had to acknowledge. He got to Hollywood the way people got to Hollywood then, which is to say, through a combination of luck, persistence, and the willingness to be in the right room when someone useful walked in. He was discovered, The word is slippery, but it's the one that fits the mechanism. By a talent agent named Joyce Selznick at a small theater production in New York in 1948. Within months, he was in California. Within a year, he had a contract with Universal International and a new name. Tony Curtis was the studio's invention in the sense that all Hollywood names were invented, but it fit him in a way that Bernie Schwartz, for all its specificity, perhaps didn't quite. He was trying to become something. The name was part of the architecture of that project. The 1950s were good to him in the straightforward sense. He made pictures. They made money. He became, briefly, one of the most photographed men in America, which is a strange thing to become, and probably stranger to sustain. He married Janet Leigh in 1951, and the marriage was the kind of Hollywood pairing that gossip columnists treated as a weather system. Always something moving through, always something to report. They had 2 daughters, Kelly and Jamie Lee. The marriage ended in 1962. He made Sweet Smell of Success in 1957, and the people who paid close attention understood that the performance Sidney J. Furie got out of him as Sidney Falco, desperate, self-loathing, morally rotten, and completely alive to it, was something different from the Curtis who had been coasting on cheekbones. The film was not a commercial success at the time. It is now understood to be one of the better American films of that decade, and Curtis's work in it is part of why. Some Like It Hot came in 1959, and whatever reservations he later expressed, famously, possibly apocryphally, about kissing Marilyn Monroe. The performance is brilliant in a way that consistently gets attributed to the film's tone rather than his craft. He plays a man playing a woman, playing a man playing wealth and confidence, and he does it with an ease that conceals the technical difficulty entirely. That's the mark of something working rather than just happening. He was nominated for an Oscar for The Defiant Ones in 1958. He didn't win. He doesn't appear to have ever fully made his peace with that particular outcome, though he was carefully measured about it in most interviews. By the mid-1960s, the momentum had changed in ways that the word slowed understates. The pictures were less consistently good. Some were genuinely bad. The personal life, which had never been uncomplicated, was generating tabloid coverage that he managed with varying degrees of success. He married again and again. He was working steadily, but steadily and well are different registers, and he was spending more time in the first than the second. The offer for the Boston Strangler reached him at a particular moment in his career when a serious dramatic challenge might have felt like oxygen rather than obligation. I've read 3 different accounts of how he came to accept the role, and they differ in their details, but agree on one thing: he didn't hesitate. Richard Fleischer was directing. Fleischer was a competent professional who had made 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Compulsion and knew how to handle difficult material without flinching into exploitation. The script, by Edward Anhalt, was adapted from Gerald Frank's book of the same name, and it was serious work. It didn't romanticize DeSalvo, didn't explain him cleanly, and didn't provide the audience with the comfort of resolution, because the actual case had provided no such comfort. The film's central formal innovation was a split-screen technique that Fleischer used to show the fractured consciousness of a man who had apparently committed crimes he could not fully remember or access. It was an unusual choice in 1968, and it remains unusual. Most films that try to represent dissociation do it through editing or performance, and the split-screen approach asks the audience to do a different kind of work. Whether it succeeds is a question that critics have answered differently depending on the decade in which they're watching. What is not a matter of debate is what Curtis did with the role. He prepared for it in the way that serious actors prepare, which meant more than memorizing lines and learning blocking. He met with psychiatrists, he read the case materials, he spent time in Boston, which is perhaps a strange thing to do in preparation for playing a man who had committed crimes there, but made a kind of sense in the way that actors make sense of things. Proximity to place as a form of proximity to truth. He put on weight deliberately, which changed his silhouette and erased some of the prettiness that had been both his advantage and his limitation. Henry Fonda played the detective hunting DeSalvo. Their scenes together were the film's architecture, and Fonda, who was not known for making things easy on colleagues he didn't respect, reportedly told Fleischer on the second day of shooting that Curtis was the best thing in the picture. Whether this reached Curtis directly or not, it was the kind of validation that arrives with particular weight when it comes from a man who does not distribute it casually. The actual shooting was difficult in ways that went beyond technical difficulty. DeSalvo was not a character in the sense that a fictional villain is a character. He was a real man, accused of real crimes against real women who had families who were still alive. The ethical weight of that sat on the production throughout. Curtis has spoken about going home from certain shooting days and not being able to find himself again easily. A formulation that sounds theatrical but describes something that actors who have played extreme material often report and that I don't think should be dismissed. There's a particular scene midway through the film where DeSalvo is in an interview room with a psychiatrist and begins to recover a partial memory of one of the crimes. Curtis plays it without the usual actorly scaffolding. No visible technique, no clear line of action, just something that looks horribly like genuine confusion and horror at what the confusion is revealing. I've watched it 4 or 5 times trying to locate where the performance begins and ends, and I can't consistently do it. That's either very good acting or something I don't have a clean category for. The film was released in October 1968 and received serious critical attention. Vincent Canby at the New York Times called it genuinely disturbing in a way that separated it from exploitation. Roger Ebert, then in his first full year as a film critic at the Chicago Sun-Times, praised the split-screen technique specifically and Curtis's work without qualification. It made money. It was not nominated for any major awards, which is the kind of oversight that looks more peculiar with each passing decade. And then something happened that is harder to document than the film's release, but that matters for understanding what the role cost. Curtis did not talk about the Boston Strangler the way actors typically talk about films they're proud of. He talked about it the way people talk about an experience they survived. In interviews through the 1970s, he would refer to the role briefly and then redirect. When pressed, and interviewers did occasionally press because the performance was clearly significant, he would describe feeling as though he had gone somewhere during the production that he hadn't entirely come back from. I want to be careful here, because actors say things like this and the statements get romanticized into a narrative of artistic martyrdom that the actual person might not recognize or want. Curtis was not a humorless man. He was capable of self-deprecation and deflection and the standard range of defenses that people in public life develop. But the specific consistency with which he avoided lingering on this particular film, across a span of years when he was otherwise fairly willing to discuss his career with candor, suggests something real underneath the deflection. The 3 actors who had turned the role down before it came to him, and the one who had quietly withdrawn after agreeing, might have known something that Curtis either didn't know or didn't think applied to him. The Bronx kid who had watched his brother die from a window, who had grown up in apartments where the particular quiet of his mother's bad periods was its own kind of noise, who had spent a career constructing a face and a name that bore only oblique relation to the person underneath. That person had been asked to spend months inhabiting a man whose inner life was a kind of obliteration. The fracture in DeSalvo's consciousness that the split-screen technique made visible was not entirely foreign to Curtis's own interior landscape. Whether he knew this going in or discovered it in the process of preparation is something I can't determine. What I can say is that the performance has the quality of genuine access rather than skilled mimicry, and genuine access always costs something. He made more films after The Boston Strangler. He worked steadily through the 1970s and into the 1980s, with varying degrees of engagement. He developed a serious drug problem that he eventually addressed, and the years of that problem were years of diminished output rather than no output, which is its own kind of discipline. He found painting and took it seriously, and exhibited and sold work that critics received with more respect than the usual celebrity artist tolerance. He married several more times. He had more children. He talked, later in life, with increasing directness about the childhood, about the mother, about Julius, about the particular way that poverty in the Bronx in the 1930s shapes a person's sense of what's possible and what's permitted. He was, by his own account, in therapy for significant portions of his adult life, which he mentioned without apparent embarrassment at a time when men of his generation didn't usually mention it. He died on September 29, 2010, at his home in Henderson, Nevada, of cardiac arrest. He was 85. His wife, Jill, was with him. There's a question that runs underneath all of this, and I want to be honest that I can't fully answer it. What did Tony Curtis know about himself that made him say yes to a role that 4 other men had walked away from? The simplest explanation is ambition. He was at a point in his career where a serious dramatic challenge felt necessary, and he was willing to pay for it. The more complicated explanation involves the specific shape of his own history, the specific nature of what he had in common with a fractured consciousness playing out on a split screen, and the possibility that he recognized something in DeSalvo that was neither identification nor sympathy, but was still recognition. The performance exists. You can watch it. It holds up in the particular way that things hold up when they were made from real material rather than technique alone. The 4 actors who didn't make it to the shoot, whatever their reasons, left a space that someone with exactly Curtis's particular history of constructed identity and authentic damage was positioned to fill. Whether that's luck or inevitability is one of those questions that the actual evidence can't settle. What I know is that he did the work, and that it cost him something, and that he never quite treated the accomplishment the way you'd expect a man to treat the best serious performance of his career. He was proud of many things. This one, he mostly just left alone. Maybe that tells you something. Maybe it only tells you that some places you go and then return from slightly changed, and the change is real enough that there's no point making a speech about it.